Tonight, we have John Hanzl, who is our dive safety officer and has been so for 5 years. He's been with the aquarium for 10 years. He has a degree in electrical engineering from BU. He's made over 3,000 dives in total, 2,200 dives in the giant ocean tank. And his favorite critter in the giant ocean tank is the southern stingray. He can tell you why, I don't know. But tonight, we're going to hear about his harrowing and fun experiences on the Andrea Doria. John.
Well, I'm glad to see so many people here tonight. This is a subject I absolutely love talking about. And my challenge tonight will be to not over-talk about it. And so I'll try to keep things as concise and to the point as possible. But this is an experience that I've been looking forward to as a diver for many, many years. I've been diving since 1989 or 87. And ever since I heard about the Andrea Doria, I knew that was something I really wanted to do. It was one of those things that I somehow, I didn't know how, but I was going to focus on getting myself to do this particular wreck. I didn't know what that meant, what it entailed, and it certainly was quite a journey for me. As Vicki said, I work at the aquarium. I'm the diving safety officer here, and it's a job I absolutely love. It's sort of my dream job. In one of the roles that I have here, I work as an aquarist in the giant ocean tank, and that's why I get a dive in the tank quite a bit. I'd say I'm one of the most photographed and yet unrecognized people in Boston because I'm the guy in the mask and there's all these flashes going off, but no one knows who I am. So this is great. I could put my face to a name, and maybe you guys can, if you ever stop by at the aquarium, feel free to stop at the top of the tank and say hi. I always love saying hi to familiar faces. So this is a talk about the Andrea Doria. Some of you may have heard about the Doria before. Some of you may have heard something about a wreck off the coast of New York. Didn't know too much about it. And some people like me may have this as a dream that you want to one day approach. And so for all of you guys, I'm hoping to, it's okay, to draw you into this whole experience that I have getting ready and then actually diving the Andrea Doria. This is an interesting crowd for me tonight because a lot of times I've given this talk to dive clubs. There's a very specific audience, people who are all divers. I don't know what the sort of the makeup is for you guys, but maybe there's a little bit of non-divers, recreational divers, and possibly technical divers in here as well. So I'm hoping to apply what I talk about to all levels. And certainly at the end of the talk, if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Also, off in this corner here, kind of dark right now, I brought the actual rig, the kit that I wore to dive the Andrea Doria. So as you will see during the course of this conversation or our talk, all of the stuff that you see in this corner over here, I wore. Every last piece of it. So this was all on me, which is kind of rough because I've had a back surgery and a motorcycle accident where I crushed my left leg. So my body was very unhappy with the path I've decided to take with my passion, but so far it's held up. Also, I'm going to point out that my wife is here tonight, and so the poor girl is sitting right here in the corner. This is Amy, and you'll hear me mention Amy throughout the course of my talk because she's had to put up with a lot of that I've gone through throughout my whole since we've been together for 10 years, but in specific for my experience getting ready and diving the Andrea Doria. And certainly that, for her, nail-biting experience of being out of touch with me for the 3.5 days where I was on the boat heading out and doing this actual dive. So she's going to be sort of a prop of mine tonight, and I apologize in advance. So like I said, I'm the diving safety officer for the New England Aquarium, and I've been diving since 1987. I am an instructor for TDI, NAUI, and DAN. I also have, amongst my recreational certifications, I have 4 different levels of technical certifications: advanced nitrox, decompression procedures, trimix, and advanced trimix. And that may be some other language to you guys. That's fine. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a bit. But it's just, I did a lot of training to do this dive. I did not just jump into this experience saying, let's just go do this. It sounds like fun. I spent a lot of time, many years getting ready for this particular dive. I'm also known by my wife as the world's dumbest person. She says that affectionately, I hope, but in ways that I am actually not dumb. I'm someone who approaches these things cautiously. As Vicki said, I'm an engineer by education, so everything is very methodical, and that's one of the things I really love about technical diving, is that on some levels it's very dangerous, but there's a lot of preparation, a lot of pre-dive planning that you must do in order to get to safely dive your targeted dive. And that appeals to my methodical engineering side, my geeky side. But before I go into the actual dive, I did want to talk about the star of the show, really, which is the Andrea Doria herself. She really was absolutely one of the most gorgeous cruise ships ever built in our history of modern ship design. She was launched June 16th in 1951, was almost 700 feet long and 90 feet in beam. So it's a fairly good-sized ship. Not the biggest ever built, but certainly she's no slouch. She did have massive twin-turbine engines that produced over 35,000 horsepower to propel her at 26 knots. Those of you who have, I've had a boat, I've had several boats in my past, and I'm like a 9 to 12 knot boater. So to think about this massive ship going 26 knots, you know that this thing has a lot of power in her engines. She can accommodate 1,290 passengers and 575 crew spread across 10 decks. And this is, for me, one of the most interesting things, because this is an Italian cruise ship. This is built in the heyday, post-World War II, of Italian pride. And so they were trying to really set this ship apart from all others. And they spent, at the time, an amazing $30 million on artwork and furnishings alone, which equates to about $250 million in today's dollars. So you can see that they spared no expense on making this just the most luxurious cruise ship that steamed, period. Many do consider and did consider the Doria to be one of the most beautiful ocean liners ever built. And although it was not said out loud because of the Titanic, many consider her to be completely unsinkable. She had a double hull, a bulbous bow. They had 11 watertight compartments below the waterline, and they really thought this ship could not be sunk. And of course, unfortunately, we all know that that is not the truth. So here's some photos of the Doria in her glory. She is a beautiful ship, tremendous Art Deco interiors, graceful lines, very sharp prow on that bow. I love looking at these photos of her when she was a living, breathing, if you want to anthropomorphize, vessel. Here's a little shot I found of her interior. This is actually a postcard. As you can see, it was very, very Art Deco in styling and very, very luxurious. There's actually, the Andrea Doria is an Admiral Andrea Doria, and there was a statue in the first class lounge of the Admiral Andrea Doria that stood proud, and actually, sort of a side story I'm not going to get into right now, but has been salvaged out of the ship. And unfortunately, they salvaged everything except for her feet, or the Admiral Doria's feet. And then later on, there was sort of an atrocity, so other divers went back and salvaged the feet, and they reunited the two together once again. So this beautiful lady did meet a terribly fateful evening. As you can see, that made the cover of Life magazine in 1956. I'm going to read this so you don't have to strain and read it yourself, but this is sort of the story of what happened. At 11:10 p.m. on the 25th of July, 1956, approaching the coast of Nantucket, Massachusetts, bound for New York City, Andrea Doria collided with the eastern-bound MS Stockholm of the Swedish-American line in what became one of history's most famous maritime disasters. Struck in the side, the Andrea Doria immediately started to list severely to starboard, which left half of her lifeboats unusable. Now keep in mind, this is 11:10 p.m. This is at night and coming out of a massive fog bank. I can only imagine the fear that was on this boat and on the Stockholm when this happened. And as you can see, she's already listing, and that list prevented both the high side, the port side lifeboats from being deployed because they were stranded. There was so much of a list to the vessel that they couldn't be lowered into the water. And quickly, the starboard side were really close to the water, so they had to get those deployed, the people in them, of course, not just don't throw them in the water, you got to get people in them before the ship listed too much to be able to deploy it. One thing that I might point out here for later on is you could see there's actually 3 pools on her aft decks, upper first class going down to the, I'll call it the economy class. I'm not sure if I was to ride this ship today, which class I would be, but it wouldn't be that top one, I can guarantee that. The Andrea Doria and the Stockholm collided at almost a 90-degree angle. The Stockholm basically T-boned the Andrea Doria at full speed. Stockholm had a sharply raked ice-breaking prow that pierced the Andrea Doria's starboard side approximately midway of its length. The collision smashed many occupied passenger cabins and, at the lower levels, ripped open several of Doria's watertight compartments. As I mentioned, she had 11 of these compartments that was to provide reserve buoyancy in the advent of one of these guys being broached. Unfortunately, this collision was so violent that she ripped through more than 2 of them, and there was not much the ship could do to stay afloat. This is an image of the bow of the Stockholm. This is the survivor. The other ship, of course, sank. She is still afloat today. They've rebuilt this ship. Over the years, she's passed through many hands. I believe she's called the Athena right now, and she is still cruising today as a cruise ship. Matter of fact, in 2008, she was attacked by pirates. So she has sort of her own tremendously storied history, but one of the critical things, I mean, this picture pretty much sums it all up. This was a tremendous impact, a deadly impact. 46 of Andrea Doria's passengers were killed during the collision, and 2 more were lost during the subsequent evacuation. And 5 members of the Stockholm were also, 5 crew members were also lost. 11 hours after the collision, the Andrea Doria capsized and sank. Spectacular aerial photography of the sinking ultimately providing a Pulitzer Prize for Harry Trask of the Boston Traveler magazine. So one catastrophe was another person's big break. And some of the photographs that he took via an airplane are available here. And you can see, of course, a lot of the debris and refuse as she goes down and the tremendous propellers off her stern as she rolls and sinks. You can sort of see on her stern, her rounded canoe stern, her name. And then finally, she's gone, except for these are lifeboats. So she left nothing but an oil stain and a few remnant lifeboats marking the place where over 50 people perished. This provided a challenge for me and many other people. Sometimes referred to as the Mount Everest of scuba diving, the Andrea Doria has captured the imagination of many divers over the year, once again myself included. She has also regrettably captured the lives of 15 adventurers who tempted fates and paid dearly. So this is what makes the Andrea Doria one of those wrecks, one of those dives that you don't approach lightly. She has claimed many lives in her history post-sinking, and as of recently as 1998. So this is a vessel that it's very dangerous to dive, and there's a lot of reasons why. She's far, far away from the coast. She's far away from any kind of help. You're out of radio contact as far as VHF. You're 119 miles from Long Island, pretty much 50 miles straight out from Nantucket. It took us 17 hours to cruise out to this vessel, which I'll get to in a little bit. She's deep. She's beyond the recreational limits, which is established as 130 feet. So this vessel is at 220 feet to 250 feet from the top of her side to the sand. So she's deep, and she's in cold, high current, unpredictable waters. The surge out in the Atlantic, the northern Atlantic, is unpredictable. The currents can change directions. They can have one current in one direction towards the surface, another strong current at the bottom, and maybe even a different direction in the middle. So you don't know where you're going to encounter on this dive. And unlike recreational diving, you have to depend upon your own skill, your tools, your training, and a little bit, although to a lesser degree, your buddy to have a successful dive. Hence all this gear that I have, a lot of redundancy, and a lot of different things, and we're going to get into that in a moment. So I've been planning, training, and preparing for the Doria for over 6 years. Like I said, this is something I've known about for a long time, but I got myself to a point in my life as a scuba diver where I felt like I was ready to attempt this challenge. I've been an instructor since 1999 or 98, and I waited many years before I felt like I was mentally, physically, and skill-wise prepared to tackle a dive such as this one. I've been convincing my wife that these types of adventures are a good idea for even longer. And I'm still trying to convince her of that. I'm not really there. I did buy her some jewelry, though, so it's a give and take. So on July 4th of last year, I touched her decks, meaning the Andrea Dorias, with my own hands. That was not a comfortable segue. And my knees. But first I had to get there. My buddy Michael and I signed up with the RV Garloo, formerly known as the Wahoo, a vessel of some repute. Any of you people who have read diving literature, and specifically deep diving literature, the Wahoo is a boat that has a pretty large and detailed history. There's two boats, the Wahoo and the Seeker, who have a lot of experience going out to the Andrea Doria and figure very, very strongly into the history of Northeast technical diving. And unfortunately, a lot of the divers who perished on the Doria were transported out to the Doria on the boat that I went out on the Wahoo, which is now called the Garloo. And the captain, Hank Garvin, who is the captain of the Garloo now, has been with the Wahoo, his crew, for many, many years. Here's a picture of her right here. There's nothing really pretty to look at, but she gets the job done. She was leaving out of Captree, Long Island, the evening of July 3rd, and we had to bring everything we would need for our two planned dives with us, which for a recreational dive is one level of stuff. For a technical dive, it's a whole nother ball of wax. You can sort of compare technical diving to recreational diving to snorkeling. So recreational diving is about as different from snorkeling as technical diving is from recreational diving. So it's a whole nother level of stuff that you have to drag along with you. This is my dive buddy, Michael Lafayette. He actually is a volunteer here in our dive team at the aquarium. I've known Michael for many years, and he sort of had a parallel vision for what he wanted to do as myself. In the car, you could see those tanks. There's actually 2 tiers of tanks. That's just for the two of us, for enough tanks for 2 dives. So we loaded that poor car up. It was pretty much sitting on its springs all the way from Boston down to Long Island. So we headed out on July 3rd. This is Bridgeport, Connecticut. We took the ferry over there to Long Island. Here's us boarding the ferry. I don't know, I kind of like this little dude who is guiding traffic. He was wearing shorts, and it kind of reminded me of, what's his name, Angus Young from AC/DC, but anyway. That's us departing Connecticut for Long Island. Sort of the sights, smells, and scenes. I'm not going to bring the smells in, but certainly the scenes you can see. I love boats that are working boats. They have a purpose, and so these tugs are pretty cool. So here we are at Captree Island, or I'm sorry, in Long Island, at Captree, where the Wahoo or the Garloo was leaving. So that is our gear for 2 dives. Michael's kit is in the red, and mine is the black, of course. You can see it over there. And pretty much the only thing that I had for me was this little backpack. Everything else was support for the dives. Just a lot of lugging, and my back hurts just thinking about it. Amy said to me before I departed, she goes, well, what about pillows and sheets? Don't you need that? And I said, of course not. This is a dive charter. They provide all that stuff, no problem. We get there. No, they didn't have any pillows or sheets. So I had to learn the hard way what being prepared means. But the pleasure of a high-end dive charter, nothing but the highest class of combinations, and cue my bunk. Actually, this is Michael's and my bunk. It wasn't hot bunking. It wasn't that bad, but it's an L-shaped thing, and so his feet and my feet sort of met in the middle over here. And that right there, that's our air conditioning. Actually, that's a lie. It was broken. It would have been our air conditioning if it worked. Here's the rest of the vessel, sort of our home away from home, and I've actually grown quite fond of this boat. It leaked everywhere. Now, I'm not talking about just sitting in the water, it was leaking, but working in the Atlantic, there's waves constantly breaking over the wheelhouse, and it leaked everywhere. I lost a battle with the boat between my bedding and the water. Every night or every few hours, I would sort of inch my body in a little more of an S-shaped contour to avoid that wicking sensation that was happening from the sheet. And it was bilge water mixed with diesel, so it was sort of an unpleasant. I will get more into that later. It gets funner. So anyway, after a brief trip to Walmart, which I'm not a Walmart guy, but it came in quite handy then, After a brief trip to Walmart for the cheapest bedding we could find, we loaded our boat with ridiculous quantities of gear and began the process of integrating ourselves into shipboard life, which of course meant not only learning the boat, but learning the crew and the other 4 passengers. There's my buddy Michael in the middle. I'm off on the right, and that's Wayne. Tech diving is a pretty small community in the Northeast, and so, excuse me, when you get involved with something like this, you run into the same people over and over and over again. If you charter a dive boat, there's only a handful of boats that I trust to go out on tech diving trips in the Northeast, off Gloucester mainly. You'll see the same guys. This guy Wayne came down from New Hampshire for diving all the time. So he gets up at 3 in the morning to get down to leave Gloucester by 6 a.m. It's pretty dedicated. So that's the entire crew right there, our crew and passengers. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the characters that were on board. And in many ways, it was the who's who of technical diving. And I was amazed. I was blown away by some of the people that I ended up diving with. And as you can see, we all have that tremendous amount of, I'm going to say it, crap. We have all this stuff that we had to load onto the boat and find homes for. And you can see there's just tanks everywhere. And we all had our own things. And of course, in technical diving, you were responsible for your own gear. You don't let anybody else touch your valves, the things back here. It's your life, so you have to be very cognizant about taking care of your own gear. So we all sort of fought for our own little patch of real estate on the boat, so we knew just where it was and make sure that it wasn't going to go overboard, for instance, during the trip out. So as 7 p.m. struck, we departed the marina and headed for the horizon. And for me, I'm a writer. I think about things in terms of story. And this is something that I've been preparing for, like I said, 6 years. And so I had a lot on my mind when this photo was taken as we were heading out of the marina into basically, for me, the unknown. There's the wheelhouse. Nothing glamorous, but it got its job done. Now, I'm going to include an excerpt from the book Deep Descent by Kevin McMurray. I found that this is a great little summation of the experience of getting out to the Doria, and it happens to be written about the Garloo. So I'll read this to you. Once again, I'll spare you the squinting. Getting beat up on the trip out is a rite of passage for Doria divers. It isn't just the mercurial Atlantic that conspires against you. The sleeping quarters aboard the speedy fiberglass Wahoo are laughingly referred to as spice racks. Boy, do I know it. The Wahoo's bunks are stacked like trays below decks, and diesel fumes mingle with the odor of dozens of sweating bodies in the claustrophobic space. The smell of fear pervades below decks preceding any Doria dive. The common belief is that if you are not scared about doing the dive, you're either lying or stupid. Few get much sleep before the dive, and the fatigue adds to the likelihood of a mishap. And so that was interesting. This book was written probably 10 years before I dove the Doria, but his description was 100% spot on to the experience. I just read that 2 weeks ago. I just threw that slide in. So this is nighttime. This is the night before the dive. I didn't use my flash. You can now picture this boat is moving, is very, very lively. One thing that I did notice during this evening is that Michael never came down to the bunk. He was conspicuously absent. There was a pervasive smell of diesel. They actually had spilt diesel in the bilge when they were fueling up before we departed. And so combating where the air conditioning, which should combat those fumes, was busted. It was a very thick, oily atmosphere within this boat. And fortunately for me, my stomach has not fallen victim to the ocean yet, but that can change for anybody. And so we're going out to the Doria. And like I said, this is a 17-hour boat ride. I did turn the flash on, and I took a picture of myself in my bunk because I figured, well, this is maybe the last opportunity to do this before actually going out on this dive. And of course, I'm thinking, who was sleeping in this bunk before me? As I mentioned, a good number of the 15 who perished on the Doria rode out on this very same vessel, and maybe rode out on my bunk. So I had a lot on my mind. I turned the flash back off. So I'm going to go into now a little sidebar before we go to the actual experience of the dive. This is, believe it or not, me, dressed like a frog man. This is on Fran's boat out in Gloucester called the Daybreaker, and Fran Marceau is a captain who I trust with my life, and I have trusted with my life, literally. And this particular set of dives I'm going to show you actually took place after the Doria, but it serves to sort of show what it takes to gear up as a technical diver. So the first thing you have to worry about is your undergarment. I use the Weasel. Wait, hang on. I use the Weasel. I am not the Weasel. And so that's this little puffy undergarment, sort of like a snowsuit. This thing, I'm not going to explain what that is. I don't know if you could see that, but some of you may already know what that is. I'll allude to it later on. Getting into technical rig is unlike getting into a recreational rig in that this is a continuous weave harness, meaning that it's all one piece. And it's so heavy, the tanks weigh so much, that you can't just pick them up and put them onto your body, or even have friends pick them up. You have to climb up inside it, almost like a spacesuit. So you drop down, squat, and then kind of come up and shrug up inside it. Keep in mind when you're doing this, I guarantee you're going to be a little nervous. You're about to do a dive that is not inherently safe. You're doing a type of dive that is actually notoriously dangerous, and where when things go wrong, you don't have the surface to go to for air. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but basically think about the fact that this is decompression diving, which means your body has undergone changes, physical changes, that will prevent you from going to the surface. And if you do, you will get bent. You will get the bends, which is a thing that you do not want to get. So you have to depend upon everything that you're wearing in your training and your buddy, so that if you do have a problem, you deal with it. It's basically called a virtual overhead. It's like being a mile inside a cave, but there's no cave over your head. It's just you have to keep that discipline, because if you do rocket to the surface, there's going to be some very, very bad consequences. So once you get into the kit, you have a lot of stuff to deal with, and the configuration of a technical diver is quite different and a lot more stuff than a recreational diver. So you have, in this instance, I have a strobe light that you deploy when you go down onto a wreck. That way everybody deploys their own strobe, so that when you go back to the ascent line to leave the wreck, you go back to your strobe. If you depended upon somebody else to deploy the strobe and they go back before you, they're taking their strobe and they're gone. You have your own strobe. It's one little thing. A backup light, I actually carry a pair of backup lights. You don't depend on any one item to keep you alive. You always have some sort of redundancy. It would be foolhardy not to. That's my primary light head. These are canister lights. These lights are on your waist, and then there's a cord that goes to the light head that you carry in your hand, and you actually have clipped off to that D-ring up there. I know that there's a gentleman here who is he's shaking his head right now. There's a guy who's a volunteer in the dive team who works for a robotics company. He has actually manufactured his own canister light, which is pretty impressive, so I got to give him his props. Oh, this is a deco computer. It's a very different type of computer than a standard recreational dive computer. It's a giant hunk of metal. It's very overbuilt, and it does a lot of stuff that a regular computer doesn't do, and it's actually quite complicated, but it's important to have. Here's your primary light canister. That's a task reel of fine diameter nylon line for doing certain tasks. I had a very specific reason for this on this dive. And then you have a primary reel, which is a massive honking reel that you need in the advent of emergency. And there's a lot of reasons where you may need that guy, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. There's a second backup light. I had a pair of snips on this particular dive for cutting through some ties and nylon. I actually did this dive for the aquarium. And then on your dry suit pocket, I always have a very specific stuff I put in each pocket so I know where to find it. In this one, on the right pocket, it's cutting shears, a finger spool, which is yet another reel of line, and a hook knife for cutting away. Cutting implements are very important. Entanglement is a huge concern when you're down on these depths. I mean, a lot of these northeastern wrecks have gill nets, monofilament, a lot of snag hazards. And if you get caught down there, you can get yourself into real trouble. So you want to make sure you have lots of redundancy to your cutting implements. On the left-hand side, I have a backup computer, a multi-page contingency plans. I'll show you what those are in a moment. Basically, it's a slate with a lot of pages on it. You can't fill your dry suit. The type of suit that I wear is for cold water diving, and you actually connect it to an air source or a gas source, and you push a button on your chest and you put air or some sort of gas into the suit, and that helps to act as insulation. Unfortunately, the type of gas that I'm breathing at these depths is not air. It's called trimix. It's a mixture of helium, oxygen, and nitrogen. You cannot use that to fill your dry suit because the helium is a very small molecule, and without getting into any detail, it's poor thermal insulator. So it's basically called gas air conditioning. So you can't fill your dry suit like you normally would off of the stuff on your back. So you have to carry a separate little bottle just to fill your dry suit. And I put a gas called argon in there because it's a big fat molecule that is a good insulator. So that's an argon bottle over there. There's my primary knife. It's a little guy. It hangs off my waist. And then in the left pocket, you have a backup mask. Once again, you don't depend upon that one mask to stay on your face. You may get it kicked off by another diver. You may lose it in current. There's all sorts of reasons, so you want to make sure to have a backup mask. And then a slate with a snap. I could touch upon that in a little bit, but if you do have an emergency, you have these bags that you can fill up with gas and like a balloon and send them to the surface on that big reel of line. So you can actually write a message on a slate, clip it to that bag, and send it to the surface to let people at the surface understand what's going on down there. I have run into a couple of instances where I've had to deploy things like that. So it's a very, very good idea to make sure you have that. And make sure you have a pencil that doesn't have a broken tip. Then finally is this thing called a P-valve. It's a little guy on my left thigh, and it's a valve. And that other thing I showed you before with the question marks, they're all connected. I'm not going to explain what a P-valve is for, but I'm sure you can use your imagination to figure that out. Keep in mind that technical diving often requires lots and lots of decompression time underwater where you're letting your body reacclimate to reduce pressures. So you end up spending a lot of time underwater. And sometimes you have to adapt to technologies that you otherwise wouldn't think about. So what I want to show you on this particular picture is that multi-page contingency slate. What this is basically my dive plan boiled down, and it's a format that I developed to give me all the information that I need in a nice, concise way. So these are 3 different pages. So this is one page on my slate, a second page, and a third page. And what this is showing you is for a planned depth of 240 feet, for instance, for each time, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, that I plan on staying on the bottom, these are the depths that I have to stop at, and these are times, and this is the gas mixture I need to breathe at. Because, oh, by the way, it's not just breathing one gas mixture. I have, if you can see on the table over here, 1, 2, 3, 4 different gas mixtures that I'm switching through. So you can see that at different depths, I'm switching different regulators and turning on different tanks to speed up my decompression. Point being, it's very complicated, and you want to make sure that you have a lot of contingencies built into your plan so that if something goes wrong, you have a go-to scenario. So 240 feet, 245 feet, 250 feet, from everything from 5-minute bounce dive to 25 minutes, which is longer than you expect to stay down there for, and what do you do in that instance? Of course, you have a dive computer that's a decompression computer, but what if that breaks? So you have to have these rules of thumb and these spare or emergency tables to help you out. My particular dive on the Doria is that one, that column right there. So I was planning on spending 20 minutes at a maximum depth of 245 feet. My decompression time, in other words, the time spent slowly getting back to the surface, was 59 minutes. So my total run time from entering the water to getting out of the water was 83 minutes. That's my plan. And with technical diving, you really do plan the dive the plan. You don't stray a minute beyond what you're supposed to be doing. Because every minute that you spend at those tremendous depths creates a huge problem later on the decompression as far as how much time you have to spend. And you may not have enough gas to make it all the way back if you spend too much time down there. To sort of show that and to show how complicated planning a technical dive is, this is the piece of software I use on my home computer to actually plan a dive. This dive is my Doria dive. Actually, it was the 240-foot profile. And this particular scenario that I did was just to show what would happen if I don't have my decompression gas. In other words, all those bottles that you'll see later on that I actually hang on my left and my right side, what if I lost those? What does that mean? How do I get back to the surface? Well, you can. It just takes a little bit longer. Unfortunately, it would take me 1,389 minutes. That's 23 hours. I don't have, I don't even bother writing that onto my slate because you don't go there. You don't lose your decompression gas, and that's why. You want to make sure you have exactly what you're planning on as far as gases, or you can run into some troubles. Amy's heard this talk several times, like I said, and every time I look over and I say some of these things, I see her face getting a little less enthusiastic about what I like to do for my spare time. So once you get into your harness and you got all your gear on, then it's a very labor-intensive process for other people to get the rest of the stuff on you, because you're not done yet. You've just got the first sort of layer of things on. And of course, you're sweating your keister off because you're inside a dry suit with lots of thermal underwear, and you're also mentally sweating a little bit. And if you're not, that you're lying or you're daft. So you want to get this stuff connected up. So anyway, so there's a crew on the boat, and like I said, you have people you really depend upon start hitching tanks up. Well, what are those tanks? No, I'm not even there yet. So we have a primary lift bag. It's that balloon that you can send to the surface. Of course, you don't carry just one, you carry two. So mine fits in the small of my back, and then the actual connecting point clips off my right hip. So if I need it, I can just grab that right hip, unclip it, and pull it, and almost like a parachute, you deploy this thing. And the one that primary one is the one on the floor over here. I know you can't see it right now, but it says Hanzl in nice big letters. So people, if they ever goes to the surface, they know who's underneath that. Then there's the backup lift pouch that is actually mounted to one of my deco bottles, or these side bottles. They're called stage bottles or decompression bottles. And then there's this thing called a John line, which is a little line about 6 feet long with a clip on the end. And basically, if you think about the fact that you spend 58 minutes decompressing, you're going to be at one point on this one rope that goes down to the wreck. And you're going to be there for a long time. So even if other divers started 20 minutes after you or 20 minutes before you, you're all going to kind of meet at those shallower depths because you're going to be there for so long. So you're all fighting for the real estate of 1 foot of rope. And that could be unpleasant because then coupled with that, tremendous currents possibly, and surface swell where you're getting yanked up and thrown back down. So you have this thing called a John line. It's not named after me. I was just lucky to be able to remember that. And it's a line that you can clip off to your ascent line, that thing that runs down to the wreck, and then you kind of come back from that and you hang out to get away from everybody else. Unfortunately, on the Doria, it was so rough that 2 people lost their John lines because they had to let it go, because the surface swell was actually yanking these John lines up and down so much that they kind of levered themselves up the ascent line to the point where they had to let them go or they'll be pulled to the surface. And as I mentioned, you have a virtual overhead. You cannot come to the surface until your body is ready. So you have to let that go and say goodbye to it and then stay down there. And of course, one tech diver thing you always carry is this expression of pain. Because this damn gear does weigh about 180 pounds. And if you throw me into the mix, I'm pushing 350 pounds. It's amazing because when I dive recreationally with a dry suit in the northern waters, and I'm wearing the exact same undergarments and the exact same dry suit, I have to strap on 40 pounds of weight to get me to sink against all that buoyancy. When I'm in my tech kit, I don't need any weight at all. This stuff pulls me down. Really good idea to make sure your gases are turned on before you jump in the water, or that could be a real problem too. And people have died because of that. So there's a lot of things to think about. I'm not trying to scare people. I'm just trying to draw you into why this training is so important and the experience is so important, so you don't just go out and do this, but it's very safe when you do it with the right amount of education and training. So here, this is Matt, one of the crew, and he's clipping another stage bottle onto my other side. And of course, every bottle, every mixture is always in the same position on me, always, every dive, so I know just where to go. Because, oh, by the way, if you grab the wrong regulator and turn the wrong tank on, you could immediately go into convulsions if you do it at the wrong depth. So that's pretty important to keep in mind. So here's Matt helping me get my 3-fingered mitts on. This dive was 39 degrees at the bottom, at the surface too, almost at the surface. So it gets a little chilly in the northeast. Actually gets really cold. Right there, like I said, this dive was after the Doria. So that little patch on my right knee pad, that is Doria rust. So I never scrubbed that off. I don't have it on anymore because it wore off on its own, but I was pretty psyched to carry that around on my dry suit. You know, this dry suit cost about $3,000, but I was really happy to have that patch of rust on my knee because to me it meant quite an achievement. So now I was going to show you about tanks. So on my back, I have 200 cubic feet of tank, and in there is this thing called hypoxic 1550 trimix. What this is, it's a blend of helium, oxygen, nitrogen, and because of the depth that I'm going to, this particular blend doesn't support, there's not enough oxygen in this tank to allow you to breathe at, right now, if I was to breathe off the regulator on the table over there, I'd pass out because there's not enough oxygen in that mix to keep you respirating at surface pressure. When you get deep enough, then all of a sudden everything changes and you can go to that, which means you have to breathe a different tank when you first jump in the water, go down a certain depth, and then switch to those regulators. Once again, I'm just trying to impress upon you that there's just lots of things to think about. Over there, I have 2 tanks. One is my travel mix. That's the thing you start the dive with. It's also your first deco mix when you're coming up from the bottom that you go to. It's another trimix, but this has 30% oxygen, so therefore you can breathe off that on the surface, no problem. My second deco mix, it's a 63 cubic foot tank. That's 50% oxygen. And then I have an 80 cubic foot over here that is 80% oxygen. So it's almost pure oxygen. And that's what you breathe. It's the largest of the deco bottles because you spend the most time at shallower depths breathing off that guy. So here's actually Michael. And you're so heavy and you're on a tossing boat that it's not a glamorous giant stride off the stern of the boat. It's more of a controlled fall. So there he goes in all his glory, and he's gone. This is a photo to show you when dives don't go according to plan. This dive did not go according to plan, hence seeing these 2 lift bags on the surface. But you can see my name, Hanzl, right here. And so it's very identifiable that hopefully I'm at the bottom someplace, or I'm underneath that lift bag someplace in the water column. And I was. So we're going to talk about the dive. So I've gone to bed, took a picture, went to bed again, got tossed around, and realized that my buddy, my dive buddy that I've been training with for 6 years, is not in the bunk next to me. This is just to show you we're the morning of. It's a little wavy.
We're almost there, man. Getting to the Doria.
So that I just threw that in there to show it's not flat calm by any stretch of the imagination. So after a lively 17-hour trek, the Doria was located on the echo sounder, and it was time to hook in. And here's an image from the echo sounder of the Andrea Doria. And for me, once again, with my imagination, it was extremely exciting to see this image, and hence I took a picture of it. Once Hank, who's the captain, had the Garloop positioned exactly where he wanted her, he gave the signal and a shot line was dropped overboard. Now, this for me is one of those bits of magic that these captains, these guys who have done this kind of diving, somehow have acquired. What you do is you take a 5-gallon bucket, you fill it with concrete, and you put a metal wire in it as a loop. You tie a long line with a couple of floats on it to it. This line was about 300 feet long. And then at the other end, you tie a big float and a couple other floats. And when the captain says, drop it, you chuck it overboard. Now keep in mind, you are pinpointing a tiny piece of ocean with this 5-gallon bucket. And if you're even 20 feet away, because of limited visibility down there, and it's not bright. I mean, it's not pitch black. I've been on dives where it's so deep it's pitch black, but it's pretty darn dark. If you miss it by even 20 feet, then it's useless. You have to actually hit the wreck. In the middle of the Atlantic, 17 hours of cruising away from shore with a 5-gallon bucket of concrete. So this is us standing around watching this process happen. So Hank gives a signal, and 2 of his crew chuck this thing overboard, and you pretty much don't want to get your ankle wrapped around that. And then at the far end, once all that line pays out, you just heave the float overboard. And that's all there is left. There's this orange ball floating in the Atlantic. and you don't know what's underneath there, but you're hoping there's going to be a 700-foot historical wreck that claimed the lives of some 50 passengers and crew and 15 other divers. So Pete Manshey and Mike Dudas of the crew were sent over the side. Their task was to chain the line into the wreck, providing all goes well. These two guys right here are sort of heroes to me, and they're crew members. Mike Dudas, his mother was the 5th woman to ever dive the Andrea Doria, Evelyn Dudas. And so she is in the history books, this most amazing woman, and her son Mike has followed in her footsteps. And he and Pete Manshey are these superheroes as far as I'm concerned. They come from all over the country to crew on this one vessel because there are so few trips that go out to the Doria. It's so dangerous, it's so specialized that not a lot of people go out there. As a matter of fact, last year in 2009, as far as I know, we were the only trip, not only the only boat, but the only trip that visited the Doria. There may have been some private boats that went out there, but there were no other commercial operations that went out to the Doria, to my knowledge. And so these guys fly from all over the country for this particular trip just to crew aboard the Garlu. And they've been doing that for years. And these guys, they know their stuff. I mean, they're some amazing divers. That's Pete Manshey right there. He's a salver from South Carolina, and he has an amazing history book of experiences. And so you can see them gearing up, kind of just taking some pictures of the process. Lots of stuff, lots of gear. You kind of saw what it takes to be a tech dive gear. The cool thing about the Garlu is that they opened up a stanchion on the side deck, and you just geared up right there. You stood up and went right overboard. You didn't have to walk anywhere. It was really nice. It kind of sucked getting back out of the water, but getting in the water was great, and that's all we were thinking about at that moment. So here they are getting in the water. They're going to follow that line down. There's that quarter-inch line underneath that orange float, and they're going to follow it down and see what's underneath. There goes Mike. So, what happened when Pete and Mike jumped in the water? Well, we didn't know. We just sat there and we watched, and the Garlu steamed around this red float, and in classical tech diving, almost folklore style of indication, they brought down 2 styrofoam cups with them, which, coming from the aquarium, is not the greenest of techniques, but it's time proven. And styrofoam, they brought those cups down, and once they accomplished their task, which I'll explain in a second, if they succeeded, they're going to let those 2 styrofoam cups go, and they'll rise to the surface, and that'll be the indication that, to us on the surface, that they succeeded in what they had to do. What they had to do is they had to follow that line down, and provided that it was on the wreck, then they were going to take a 6-foot length of chain and chain a shackle on the end of that line, wrap it around a big piece of the Andrea Doria, and then reshackle it back to the ascent line. So in essence, the Garlu on the surface is now hitched, anchored to the wreck itself. I guarantee a 700-foot wreck is a pretty effective anchor, so we're not going to go anywhere. And sure enough, not only did Captain Hank nail the wreck, but he put that 5-gallon bucket exactly where he wanted it, which was on the bow, right by the famous crack, which you can see, I'll talk about in a minute, but is the crack just behind the descent line. So here's the line that they followed down. They chained it right into that portion of the bow, and then they completed their dive, because they were here to dive the Doria too. So they dove the Doria, and then an hour and a half later, they surfaced, and it was time for the rest of us to go diving. With the Wahoo moored to the wreck, it was go time for me. Unfortunately, my buddy had been violently seasick for the past 24 hours, and when I was unable to do the dive. Michael didn't come down to the bunk because he was violently seasick, to the point where there was talk of having to airlift him off the boat because he was so dehydrated. And Michael does not get seasick. I've done a lot of dives with this guy. He was down in Antarctica, a couple months before. Does not get seasick. Unfortunately, it was a combination of the diesel, the current conditions, everything led him to become really ill, to the point where he never even came inside. And I'll leave it to the fact that he was really sick, and he was too sick to dive. Being dehydrated is a very, very dangerous situation when you're tech diving because it makes you more prone to getting this thing called the bends. There's Michael up towards the bow. This is the beginning of when he got seasick. This is before the overnight, and he pretty much stayed anchored to that position when he wasn't twisting overboard for the next, I don't know, 15 hours. Now, here's the thing. You train for these dives as a team, and you know communication-wise, that you have a certain way of interacting with somebody. You know their limits, you know how they dive, and that's really important. You're still dependent upon your own abilities, but you depend upon your buddy to be your backup whenever possible. I did get hung up on a piece of monofilament on a wreck called the YF, was it 240? Up here it's a 415, the YF 415. It's a 240-foot deep wreck off Gloucester. And I was down there and I was swimming along and I was like, boy, this is one heck of a current. And I'm not moving. And then I looked down with my light, and that's a pitch black wreck. And Michael's sawing away at an invisible piece of monofilament that had gotten hung up on one of my stage regulators because I hadn't stowed it, which I was supposed to do, on the way down. So that's a great example of why you have a buddy, because that would be an unpleasant situation to be in without him being there. But unfortunately, he was too sick to dive. So what do you do then? I'm going to do the dive, and this is sort of a solo sport, even though you do have a dive partner. So I paired up with a guy named Gary Gentile for my first dive. Has anybody heard of Gary Gentile? Okay. So I didn't know Gary. I'll tell you who he was for those of you who don't know. I didn't know that he was on board. So I'm going to back up to when I first got on the boat and was beginning to meet everybody on the crew and the other passengers. Like I said, there was only 5 of us. And when I walked into the salon, there was this book lying on the counter called Shadow Divers Exposed by Gary Gentile. There's a really great book called Shadow Divers about the discovery of a submarine in New Jersey. And deep wreck, a lot of people lost their life once again trying to discover what this submarine is, what its origins were. They just knew it was a U-boat. So, and I've read this book. Amy's read this book. I know Chris over here has read this book. And it's very engaging. But this guy, Gary Gentile, wrote an expose, or what he considered an expose, about shadow divers called Shadow Divers Exposed. And as a writer myself, I was sort of put off by this particular book because I felt like he was trying to ride the coattails of somebody else's notoriety. So in John fashion, for those of you who know me, I walk in and I was staring at this book on the salon and I'm like, man, and I was going to say what my mindset about this person's writing this book. When Captain Hank walks in and looks at me and looks at the other guy sitting there, who I was going to say this to, and he said, John, have you met Gary Gentile? Of course, who wrote this book. So I was really glad that I didn't do that, because that would have been somewhat embarrassing. And as it turns out, Gary and I became good friends over the course of this experience and traded books and the whole 9 yards, and is quite an amazing individual. So he and I decided to pair up to do the Doria. So with the dive plan I prepared, blown completely out of the water, and a dive buddy I've never even met before, it was time to prep for the most challenging dive of my life. I also had a dive buddy who was up towards the bow vomiting every 15 minutes. And of course, I had to go up there to get my deco bottles. So I was downwind of him, and it was very distracting. So these are some pictures of me getting ready for this particular dive, trying to keep my game face going. You can see there's my game face. It's not a very good one. I got to work on that. And just getting ready. It's a lot rougher than these pictures look. I guess that's always the case with the ocean swells. But the boat's moving along pretty good as far as side-to-side rocking. We're anchored, and the wind is just howling, but the wheelhouse is blocking it back here on the stern part of the boat. But we are now hitched to the wreck, and not only that, they have all the slack pulled up so that there's no scope on the anchor line. So the boat's not riding like a normal anchor over the swells, its bow's coming soaring up, and it goes twang as it comes up short, and the whole boat just explodes with this shudder, which I didn't realize right away, but makes the decompression process on the other end of the dive a living hell. But here I am getting ready for the dive. Good thing I didn't know that. Pete's giving me a hand. And once again, this is a very labor-intensive for other people. And these guys were so great, I already got to know them, that I did have a lot of trust in their ability to help me. But once again, nobody touches your valves. This is your source of life, these things back here. You want to make sure they're open and in a position you expect them to be in. And so no one ever touches your valves. It's my mantra. So I'm getting ready to get ready. There's Gary, actually, and he's in his dry suit back there. He dove the crustiest old gear I've ever seen. I don't know how he's still alive, but he's a great diver. I have like all new stuff. It's all black. It's like Navy SEAL. His stuff's got patches all over the place. I don't know. So here I am getting ready. You notice I have my name on my tanks. You have, I don't know if you can see that down there, but you have the actual mixture on each tank written both for you to see up here on the top of the tank and on the side for your buddy to see, in case you do grab the wrong hose and you start to put that thing in your mouth and it's the wrong one. Like I said before, that could kill you. So it's really important to know which mixture you're about to breathe. So they're just checking everything out. That's my light canister light right there, and the light head right above it, and my backup light, and a bunch of other stuff. The other thing is that you're wearing big, thick gloves. When I dive in the giant ocean tank, it's minimal gear. It's great. I don't even wear a weight belt. I don't even wear a buoyancy compensator. I just control my buoyancy with my lungs. It's awesome. Here, completely the opposite. You're wearing big, thick gloves. You can't feel anything. You have no sense of that fine tactile feedback that is so important to finding things, and everything is blind. You can't see because your mask is in the way. You don't see anything down here. So everything you do, you learn by rote and through just knowing it's supposed to be there, and you just find it. And you can't depend upon like, oh, I'll look for it over here. Oh, that sounded pretty loud. It's a matter of learning this stuff and muscle memory. So there I am. I'm all kitted up, and in my mind, believe it or not, I'm ready to dive the Andrea Doria. I'm 45. I'm old enough now that this mask has bifocals in it. Because I'm nearsighted, but I discovered my arms are no longer long enough for me to see my deco computer. And I discovered that as a surprise during a training dive up in New England, and I had to get a bifocal mask because I need to be able to see that deco computer. So sometimes age catches up with everybody. So here I am, dropping off the side of the Garloo into the water, soon to be followed by Gary Gentile entering the water. I love that photo. I think it's just really cool. I didn't take it. And then there I am, drop below the surface. It's kind of a lie. I don't know if you can see that, but it says Hanzl right there. That's actually, I'm standing right there, but it looks like I went in the water, so I threw that in there. So dive one, the actual dive. The process is pretty straightforward. You use this. You drop down this shot line, this line that's hitched to the wreck, and then you go do whatever it is you want to do. When you're all done, you come back up the line, and you get out of the water. And you can go 6 or 7 decks towards the keel, or you can go down in one deck and then follow it. But of course, I wasn't going to do that because I promised Amy I wasn't going to do that. So I dropped down the descent line, and it was very cool. The visibility was about 15 or 18 feet. It's not tremendous. This is not a photograph. This is an artist's rendering. You will never see the Doria like this, ever. You could see maybe this much of the Doria from that descent line. So I was dropping down this thing. It takes about 3.5 minutes of just dropping to get from the surface to the depth that I was going to. The top sides of the Doria is about 210 feet deep, and then the bottom is 245, 250 feet deep. My plan was to drop down to the tie-in point, deploy that strobe onto the line, hitch my reel, that big reel, so that I wouldn't lose my bearings as to where that really critical line to the surface is, and run aft towards the crack, and then look into the crack. And then it was basically going to be a 20-minute dive, and then come back to the ascent line, get my strobe, and head north. So I kind of did that. I dropped down, I deployed my strobe. One of the things that often wreck divers, who are technical divers, wreck meaning the wreck of the Andrea Doria, do is they'll take their stage bottles off, and they'll clip them not to the ascent line, but near the ascent line. You don't want to clip them to the ascent line, because that line ever breaks, then there goes your stage bottles. And as I showed you, that means 23 hours of deco, which can't happen. So I got to the bottom. My knees touched the wreck. I got that rust on my knee pads. And I took my first stage bottle off. And I took my John line, I wrapped it around a piece of the wreck. And I'm holding my stage bottle. And I'm looking at the side of the wreck as it drops. It rolls down into nothingness and into the gloom. I look at my stage bottle again, and I think about what would happen if I accidentally dropped that thing, and I clip my stage bottle back on. So I kept all my stages with me during the course of the entire dive. I did take my reel, and I clipped it off to near the line, once again not up to the line, and I head back towards the crack. About that time, Gary drops down, and now he's on the wreck as well. These dives are staged so that every hour a pair of divers goes into the water. That gives you enough time to allow the divers who are already down there to sort of clear. So I passed a pair of divers when I went in as they were decoing. It was Pete and Mike Dudas. And by the way, when I got into the water, and there's a line tied from the stern of the boat that leads up to the bow and is hitched to this descent line. And when you jump in the side, because of the surface currents and the wave action, you kind of find that line and you kick like hell against any current to the descent line and follow it down. I was already exhausted by the time I got to the descent line. I was fighting so much surface swell. And keep in mind, you've got a lot of stuff on, and you have a pretty highly energized system at this point. So by the time I dropped down, I was already not tired, but I was feeling it pretty good. So I got down, Gary got down, and he joined up with me. He didn't run a reel. He actually knows this wreck a little bit better than I do. He went into the crack, and he dropped down and was gone. That's his plan. We already agreed. We weren't diving the same plan as far as getting in and getting out, but we were going to be on the wreck together at the same time. I go to the crack. I drop down into the crack. I go about 20 feet deeper, so towards the starboard side of the boat now because it's lying on its side. And I look around. I could see just this twisted steel, and I can look into all of these cabin areas, and but it's very limited visibility, and your breaths are dislodging silt clouds from the overhead. It's all sharp, edgy, rusty material that's very, very threatening. And I see a wolf eel. Now, I had just, for the aquarium, I had been in charge of a transport of wolf eels from the Biodome in Montreal down to our aquarium and the one in Norwalk, Connecticut. And so I was already really fond of these animals. And this wolf eel, this vicious-looking thing, is staring back at me. It actually was an ocean pout. I was wrong, but I thought it was a wolf eel. And it's looking at me, and for me, that was the coolest thing. I'm like, okay, that's it. My time is up. I reel back up out of the crack. I reel back to the ascent line, and I begin my ascent. And that was the extent of my dive number one. The only thing to mention about it is this part of the shot line, this 30 to 20-foot section where you spend the bulk of your time decompressing, was hell, basically. Like I said, the bow of the Garloo would snap that line taut with a twang, and you're holding onto that line, but you have to let it kind of race through your hands, because if you grabbed it, it would start pulling you to the surface like really quickly. So you had to let it go, and then you clamp on it, hold on to it a little bit, and then it would plunge down, and you let it go, and it would start burning through your gloves because it was just screaming through your hands. And that's 59 minutes of that. Those are some very, very long minutes, and all your stage bottles are flying up under your armpits because they're all fairly light at this point because you breathe them all down, and you're getting hit by these things, and it makes you realize that you're not doing something that you should take lightly. But all in all, it was an absolutely amazing experience, and that was my dive number 1. After the dive, Gary came up to me and shook my hand and told me that this was his 170th dive on the Doria. 170th dive. I didn't know what to say to that. He also told me that I was this close to his secret spot number 23. He's been in this wreck so many times, he knew exactly where he wanted. The thing is that, remember I showed you the swimming pools at the stern before the ship went down? Those pools are all lined with these really intricate, Italian-made, of course, tiles. The crew wanted to go to the stern of the wreck because Pete and Mike Dudas, had been working on the previous year on a purser's cabin on this massive cabinet with pry bars. And towards the end of the dive, they actually got it pried away from what it was hitched to, and it toppled over onto its face. And this dive, this trip, they wanted to go back to that spot to flip that thing over, and they were pretty sure, being in a purser's cabin, it was going to be filled with china. But the one person who wanted to go to the bow was Gary Gentile, and what Gary Gentile wanted, he got. So we went to the bow because he wanted to go to his secret spot 23, which is a wine storage area. And he was very secretive of all his different secret spots, but because I was with him, I actually know where that is now. I know right where he went. So if I ever go back, damn. I didn't say when I go back. I said if I ever go back. So fast forward through a night of food I couldn't eat. I don't eat mammal, so everything on that boat was made out of mammal. They would bring out these huge things of steak and pork, and then they had snacks that were wrapped in steak and pork. And I couldn't eat anything except for chips and salsa for the entire time. I mean, I had a couple other things, but it was all this baked, greasy stuff. But that's okay. I didn't tell him I was that picky. And holding on to and dumping a 5-gallon bucket for my still ill buddy. He was vomiting that night too, and Hank made me bring him inside, and I brought him down to the bow, which is the forward set of cabins, which wasn't even where we were staying. And these poor guys were in their bunks trying to get some sleep, and there's Michael on the floor with this 5-gallon bucket, and me bringing it outside and taking care of it, and myself thinking, this is not really what I want to be doing, but of course you have to do that. And watching the bilge water soak up into my Walmart bedding, and sort of moving away from it as much as I could. Anyway, after all that, and the seas were doing their thing, which I find actually to be quite relaxing, it was time to dive again. So for dive number 2, I had a different plan. The upper superstructure since '56 has slowly sloughed off the wreck and then fallen down to the ocean floor. And so there's this huge debris field of many, many decks that are collected on the bottom. The bottom being, like I said, around 245, 250 feet down. So my plan was to go off the side, or really the top of the wreck, and drop down through this stuff and go to the bottom and look for maybe something to bring back with me. I've never been the China fever. I've never been drawn by having to collect something. I want the experience, not that keepsake. But I sure thought it would be awesome to have a keepsake. So I dropped down. This time I went by myself, except for the fact that Michael, by this time, had sort of come back to life a little bit and had been hydrating himself all morning long. I went in probably around 11 o'clock. And so Hank pulled me aside and said, listen, John, Mike really wants to do this dive, but he has to be really cautious. And so just ensure that he stays very, very, very conservative. So, and he did. He went down, he touched the wreck, and went back up. Now, he's a numbers guy. And as we were driving down to the ferry, he looked over at me and he said, John, if you take a look at all the training we've done, all the gear we've paid for, and all of the trips that we paid for, and all the gas that we breathed, each dive is about $300 worth of gas per person. He said, that amortizes out to about $15,000 a dive for the Andrea Doria. And so I was thinking, that night I said, well, or for you, it's about $30,000 a dive. So Michael did spend about 30 grand, but he got down to the Doria, touched her with his self, and got back up. I, on the other hand, and he actually was coming down when I was heading back up, but I got down, tied my reel off to near the descent line, and dropped over the side and worked my way to the bottom. But I do have to admit, I did have a very eerie sensation when I was coming through this colossal structure to get to the bottom, where I was the only person, period, on this wreck. I was completely by myself. All the other divers, the pair had gone before me, were up here. Michael hadn't come down and may not, as far as I know, do the dive. I was by myself on this wreck. And as I'm dropping past the stuff, you can actually see window after window after window after window as the way down. I mean, it's a huge wreck. And all these cranes and all this debris and stuff, just huge stuff coming out at all different angles. And of course, some gill nets stuck on them, although not too bad. And I thought, if I got hung up, if the back of my tank got snagged on something, no one's going to know. They don't know where I am. I mean, yeah, granted, I did have my reel, and so they could have followed it down. But they wouldn't have even known I was in trouble, because I mean, you go 15 feet and you're invisible because of visibility. So that kind of brought some clarity to my plan. I touched the bottom, I looked around, and I reeled myself back up very, very carefully as I was turning and making sure that there was hopefully nothing that was going to snag the back of my valve and get out of there. I didn't find any pottery or any spoons or any teacups or anything, and I'm fine with that. I did find an amazing wreck that I had an opportunity to dive on. Now, we're almost done with this talk. I definitely will be happy to answer any questions you guys may have. But one of the things that, as an engineer, I was thinking about is, okay, well, we've gone to this wreck. We've chained ourselves into it. How do we get away from the wreck? How do you get off this wreck? And I did find out how it was done. And I found out that it required a set of cast iron, because what happens is one of the crew, in this case, this guy, Billy Vogel, drops off the side, follows the line down to the bottom and to where that section of chain is hitched between the ascent line and the wreck. And he has with him a 6 foot or so length of fairly small diameter nylon dock line. And he ties that line, shackles it, around the Doria and back into the ascent line, thereby freeing that chain. But this is a much smaller diameter piece of line than a big, massive chain. And in theory, what's supposed to happen is once he then goes back to the surface, the captain leans on the line with the engine. In other words, he backs down on that line and he snaps it. And now we're free from the wreck, and they pull up this line and away we go. Unfortunately, that's not how it went. This is the risks that happen in this type of diving. What happened was Billy went down the line, put this fuse, this little section of small diameter line in place, freed up the chain, and that tremendous surface action snapped the line while he was down on the wreck. So he was just beginning his ascent when this happened, and he heard this bang. And all of a sudden, the line that he was coming up starts screaming through his hands. He clamps down on it, and he gets dragged like a pendulum, because it's hitched to the garlow on the surface, and all this wind is blowing it backwards away from the wreck. He gets dragged up through 2 deco stops. It pulled him up right up through 2 deco stops to 140 feet from 220 feet. And then Hank realized what had happened right away, and he freed that line. He put the float on it instantly, and got us disconnected from the line. But we didn't know what was happening with this guy down in the bottom of this ascent line. We didn't know if he was still on the ascent line, if he was stuck on the wreck with no ascent line. So luckily, he was. That's Billy right there, and of course that's the float that was hitched to this ascent line. We hadn't known the extent of what had happened. We did know that he did not come up when he was supposed to come up. Because, of course, we know everybody's profile is known. Everybody says what our profile is, what our total runtime is. And it was about 20 minutes after his total runtime was up that he did finally pop to the surface. But we could see his bubbles coming to the surface. He was dragged up there past 2 deco stops, but they're deep stops. And so he decided to add extra minutes to his final deco stops, knowing that he was now free drifting and in the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle literally of nowhere. Like I said, we were about 120 miles from Long Island. So he was floating underneath this ball. Luckily, the captain never lost sight of it, but he could have just been by himself in the middle of the Atlantic. But he wasn't, but we still weren't sure if his body was going to react poorly to that. And this is just him coming aboard. You can see, I'll tell you how we get aboard, but it's off the stern on the swim platform. And you have to lug yourself up with all your gear, that 350 pounds of total weight, to get onto that swim platform. We didn't know what was going on with his body at this point.
Joe, get those bottles out of there quick. Joe.
All right, so he's fine. He was okay. We did deploy O2 oxygen out of the salon. They have like a 50-foot hose, and we brought that out, and he was on O2 for a while. He was pretty shaken up for somebody who has a tremendous amount of experience crewing on this boat and doing this particular dive, because that's not the way you want a dive to go, because you don't know what's going to happen to your body at that point. But that was definitely a risk that he did take. He was amazing. During the course of while we were tied onto the wreck, we had deployed the little rib that was part of the Garloo, and it was on a 20-foot painter line off the stern. And we're all standing on the stern deck and having some sodas and after the first day's dive, and we're watching, and somebody says, "Isn't that our rib?" And it was just drifting away. And once again, in the middle of the Atlantic. And he dove off the boat into the cold Atlantic waters in his short and his T-shirt and swam for that thing, and got on board, started the motor, and got it back. He was pretty fearless, but that certainly, this particular experience put the fear of God into him. So, in conclusion, I did have a spectacular experience, and one that I was hoping for, and definitely I would do it again, and I do hope to do it again. This year I traded another experience for this one, but it was people that I will never forget that I met. Gary Gentile turned out to be an amazing individual. There is a lot of stories that would happen in the salon, of course, because these guys have such a body of experience diving this wreck and historically diving technical dives and deep dives. And Gary actually was kicked off this boat as a crew years ago in the 80s for an altercation he had with Janet, who was captaining the boat at the time. And it involved these Italian divers from Italy who came to place a commemorative plaque down on the Doria because of the fact that it was this Italian wreck, and they wanted to pay their respects. Unfortunately, there was a lot of talk about these guys not being Northeast divers, not being cold water divers, not being ocean divers, but deep lake divers. They had a lot of experience and a lot of deep experience, but it's a different experience to dive in these cold, sort of unforgiving waters, that they're really concerned that they didn't have that. And so there's a lot of argument going on there. And Gary got in a big argument and ultimately was banned from being a crew for many, many years. But one side story that came out of that Hank was relating was that they had this plaque, and the leader of the Italian mission, their expedition, insisted on carrying this plaque himself over the side of the wreck and over the side of the boat and down to the wreck. And the suggestion by the crew was, well, don't you think you want to put it in a bag, have it secured to you? And he said, oh, no, I'm going to carry this myself. So he and his team jump overboard, and he immediately pops to the surface, and I'm probably paraphrasing here, but he goes, "Mamma mia, I dropped it!" And he dropped the plaque. that he brought all the way from Italy, he dropped it. Luckily that actually Hank went down and recovered it, and apparently, as rumor has it, I think it was Steve Belinda, on a subsequent dive, recovered the plaque, and I think that now lives in his living room. Because technically it's part of the wreck, so I guess I thought that was not probably the nicest thing to do, but these guys are their own personalities. So there we are, excited. Mike Dudas, Evelyn Dudas' son, who was the 5th female to ever dive the Andrea Doria. There's my bedding. I noticed that it said just the other day, I noticed it has a 3-year warranty, but that wasn't my experience. That's the group back in Long Island, safe and sound. By the way, Marcy Belinsky, who is with Gary, this woman right here, is an absolutely amazing individual. She did not feel comfortable doing the first dive. She was not feeling the greatest from the crossing, and she knows her body, and decided not to do that dive, which is why I dove with Gary. But she is also, have to give this woman credit. She is an amazing diver, and also somebody who can put up with a bunch of guys on a boat who are sweaty and disgusting and talk like a bunch of guys on a boat. So she was a pretty amazing individual. And Gary taught me one really important thing, which was, he said, Johnny, you have to learn to respect your fear. So you have to understand that fear is part of the process, and to listen to it. And it's telling you something. And so I definitely take that to heart. So there's Michael and I back out front of my place in the South End here in Boston after a successful trip and a little final. Sammy.
All right, Michael. Congratulations. Likewise. All right. Good trip.
And that's that.